Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. In today's episode, I'll be discussing and counting down my favorite TV series of the year. I've been delaying this episode. I was going to do something around my favorite films of the year as well. I watched many films this year. It was a very good year for films. Not as great for TV, definitely impacted more significantly by the writer's strike. So a lot of my picks are going to be consensus picks. But there are a few surprises in there, so I do definitely want to call out things that I think are not getting enough attention here at the end of the year. And then after that list, I'll also be running down some of my most anticipated series of the year, so stay tuned for all of that. I'll save the favorite movies of the year conversation for next week, when finally, hopefully, we'll have the Academy Award nominations announced. I'll use that as an excuse to discuss some of those nominees and include my own favorites. I still have a lot of blind spots. Just this week, a whole bunch of the films that are contending for some of the higher profile awards are just coming to streaming now. All that is to say, I'm still catching up, but it will be my incomplete list of favorites. And maybe in the middle of the year, I'll do some kind of catch up where I talk about my favorite films of the first half of the year, plus all the catching up I did on 2024, because a lot of these things are probably not going to be conveniently streaming until March or April, like at the time of the Academy Award ceremony itself. So it's always hard to catch up, and there's so much stuff that comes out at the end of the year. I honestly find it annoying because I spend months and months and months waiting for something good to come out in cinemas, and then of course they pack them all in at the end of the year. And oftentimes these things get presented to critics and not even available to stream for months for average viewers like you and me. That conversation will probably include Darren, who's back from vacation, and I'll be asking him about that next week when we talk next. But in this very episode, before he went on vacation, I did ask him if he wanted to shout out any TV series in case I did an episode like this one, so I will be including his comments where our lists overlap. Some quick show notes, of course. Severance coming back this very week. It's going to be a big deal. There's a lot of press around this show. They're doing a full court press to the press, and some of the things that have been said in these recent conversations confirm my own theories in the Severance episode I published last week. So if you want to listen to that episode as a way to get caught up or remind yourself of that series, do check it out. And most important of all, if you want to watch Severance for free and you don't have an Apple TV Plus subscription. And by the way, quick point that Darren and I have agreed that we will be discussing week to week. Also an Apple TV Plus series, also a spy series, considering so much spy content on the air right now. The new series Prime Target, which comes out the same week that The Agency is wrapping up. Also very popular here on our feed, The Agency TV series. But if you want to watch that show, if you want to watch Severance, if you do not have an Apple TV Plus subscription, I just confirmed this morning. It is still available. Go to Best Buy. This is in the US. I don't know if this is international. It may very well be. If you are in the US, and honestly, try this out wherever you are if you need this, go to bestbuy.com, search for Apple TV free subscription, and you will find a 3-month subscription to Apple TV Plus. Put it in your cart and go to checkout, and you'll see that it costs $0 and no tax. And you'll receive an email with a code you can use to activate your subscription. This doesn't work if you have a current subscription, but any new or returning Apple TV Plus subscriber should get this. This is all part of this promotional push to make Severance massive. So if you've been curious and want to know what the hubbub is all about, this 3-month subscription would cover you throughout the run of Severance and also throughout the run of Prime Target. So that was the most important thing I wanted to mention to everybody. And as usual, if you'd like to reach out to us, needssomeintroduction@gmail.com. I always answer your emails, always look forward to your feedback. And as I'm catching up on my favorite films of the year, do check me out on Letterboxd. My link to my profile is right in the show notes. Darren also has a Letterboxd account, and you can see what his thoughts on this year's films are as well. And just one more moment on the fact that, of course, the fires continue to burn in Los Angeles. This is part of the delay, of course, in discussing the end of year. And even some upcoming films have had their premieres delayed, so promotion is being delayed as well. That, of course, is the least of everyone's concern when you see thousands of people losing their homes and over a dozen people and potentially more have passed away in the fires. And of course, the heroic firefighters who are coming from multiple states to help put this fire out. We actually have a lot of listeners in that Los Angeles area, so our hearts go out to you. And I hope this is a fun distraction for you while you hope for the best outcomes, the best possible outcome for all of you out there. The fires are beginning to be contained, but there's still a long way to go. Okay, something far more frivolous, but hopefully interesting to you nonetheless. Let's take a look at the shows of the year. Okay, first of all, just to call out some of my blind spots. As I mentioned before, I think I've been compiling this list of my favorite films of the year, and there are something like 50 of them that are either not available to me or still just in limited release in theaters, not available in my area, not available at all, haven't been released in any way, or foreign films that have not had a digital release. As opposed to the consensus picks around TV series seem to be about a dozen or so, and honestly, my list is not going to look that original. And part of this might be the writer strikes. There's actually many series that are premiered this year that could be very intriguing, and I'm going to run down some of those as well towards the end. So first thing, blind spots. This is not really blind spots, like I mentioned before, because these have not been released yet, or they're in a foreign language or available on some microservice somewhere for streaming. These are just more my taste, and I want to provide that context. Number one, Abbott Elementary, a show that I found very entertaining in season 1. This is my particular issue. I do not gravitate to sitcoms, especially this type of traditional network sitcom where you're watching 20, 25 episodes a year. And I want to shout that out because I am in the minority here. I worked at a large publishing house in New York some 5 years ago or so, and my entire team of techs were all just discovering The Office. And Friends, by the way, all right out of college. And these shows were all new to them. And they love to watch these shows, sometimes over and over again. And I know that that is why some people come to television. I'm traditionally, historically, more of a movie guy. I'm there for the story, for the twists, for the subtext, things that are usually not present in sitcoms or traditional procedurals that run for decades. All that is to say that Abbott Elementary is exactly that type of show, and I know people love this show for the characters, and I do want to call it out because for people who have seen it, they said this was yet another really entertaining season of the show. So if you are a fan, I believe that's just coming back for its second half of season, reportedly still as good as it's been. All right, 2 more blind spots for me that are also comedies, but these kind of prestige comedies, a new genre to some extent, both available on HBO. One is Hacks. I, once again, very much liked the first season of Hacks. Jean Smart, again, just won a Golden Globe just a week ago. I think this is her second or third time winning for the same role. She's great on the series. I watched season 2, diminishing returns for me, and once again skipped season 3, but on many top 10 lists. So just wanted to mention everybody that is coming back for a 4th season. Also on HBO, the 3rd season of Somebody Somewhere, which is a semi-autobiographical dramedy. And also, I heard great things about season 1. I liked season 1. I was not over the moon like many people were for that show. But it was doing something unique, this quiet and naturalistic tone, and these characters who are really all misfits finding themselves. And I did appreciate what it was doing different than what you're used to seeing in these type of shows. And yes, season 3, once again, very good reviews for this. Season 3 wrapped up this year. So if you are a fan of that show, do check it out. I have not seen season 2 or 3. Not really my vibe, but I did appreciate season 1 for sure. My last blind spot is Interview with a Vampire. I'm probably going to have to catch up with this, especially now that it's available on Netflix. Partially, this was just hard for me to watch because I didn't have AMC Plus. And it did premiere right around the time of, I think, the finale of Better Call Saul, which is a show obviously we covered here on the podcast. And I am a fan of those Anne Rice novels. I read them when I was much, much younger, so that might be part of the disconnect here with vampire shows now at this age. But I was very much looking forward to this. It is beautifully produced, looks great. The performances are all top-notch. But I tried to watch season 1 and I could not get into it. I only got about 2 or 3 episodes into it. Never went back to it. Once again, inconvenient for me to watch. But now it's season 2. Everybody's been raving about this show. I might have to go back and give it another shot. And since the season 1, the entirety of it is available on Netflix, relatively easy way to catch up with at least half of the show. By the way, Hoopla and I believe Canopy as well have season 1 available to stream as well as Netflix. And I mention that because I do not believe season 2 is coming to Netflix anytime soon anyway. But I would assume that you will see it on the library apps, Canopy and Hoopla, in the near future. So keep your eyes peeled if you are looking to catch up on season 2, which is all wrapped up already. But again, season 1 didn't really work for me, but I've heard so many people telling me I have to watch it. I might have to catch up with it. We'll see. We'll see. There's so many other things to watch this year. We'll get to the list of many, many upcoming shows that we'll probably be covering to some extent here on the podcast. Okay, next up, my honorable mentions. Near the bottom of my honorable mentions, first of all, to call out Fallout. This is a series that didn't fully work for me. If you heard my comments on it here on the podcast, I loved the pilot episode of this show. I thought it was just fantastic. Could not wait for that mystery of what's happening within the Fallout shelters to play out. The comedy, the tone. You don't have to be a fan of the video game, by the way. This is a video game adaptation to follow along with the plot. And even though it didn't fully pay off or all of the intriguing elements of the plot, it definitely made me very curious to see a season 2. Walter Goggins, of course, terrific. Ella Purnell, which we can talk about again here on this list in a few minutes. A lot of fun as well. Okay, next up on my honorable mentions list, Presumed Innocent, which of course we covered in detail here, the Apple TV Plus series. Sona and I watched this series and we were absolutely knocked out. Speaking of being knocked out by a pilot episode, what an incredible first 2 episodes of that series. It did not pay off all the potential hinted at there, but still really satisfying. By the way, this is one of Darren's favorite, so let's cut to that conversation briefly. Oh, I know you saw Presumed Innocent. We covered it here on the podcast, also very popular for us on the podcast. That was a lot of fun. I would say, though, that quality of that show really turned around if you hear me and Sona cover it from week to week, where the first 2 episodes, which did the traditional Apple TV Plus 2 episodes week 1, me and Sona were like, man, this show is exploring the complexities of marriage and the performance that marriage is. And this is so deep. I can't believe it. We were knocked out by the first 2 episodes of that show. And then by the end, we're like, this is just a really stupid, but extremely entertaining, by the way, extremely entertaining. But like all that depth that was hinted at earlier on in the show was pretty much gone. But it was a very fun show to watch for sure.
Yes, I had the same experience. I mean, I was watching and then I was listening to you guys chat about it week to week, so it did extend the enjoyment of it. But it was a must watch for me and my wife. And but yeah, it did get a bit pulpy towards the end. But then you still could guess about how it was going to end, who was the killer, who was the murderer, how did it happen. And Jake Gyllenhaal, he's very watchable in anything. I think he's just cool. He just looks like he's got nothing else on in his life except acting. he just gives so much of himself. But I didn't buy his relationship with his wife. We were like, that. How could they be together? They seem totally separate as a couple, but it was a cool show.
Well, I would defend that whatever versions of themselves that they are at this moment, that they're together. They even say this because, they want to keep the family together. But yeah, to your point, and we mentioned this on the pod when we were covering it here on a podcast as well, that it feels like whatever people those were, we're not seeing those people anymore. Like that, it's a long walk from there to here, basically. It is also hilarious. I didn't like the Roadhouse remake movie, but I very much liked him in it. I thought like his charisma was on full blast in that. And it made me remind me how he can be in a very charismatic role. Because oftentimes he plays like, I think he's incredible in Nightcrawler, for example, but obviously like a true anti-hero, right? And, when you see him in Roadhouse, he gets to play, like lean fully into his charisma. It was so much fun to watch him in that film. But he also still had the physique, the Roadhouse physique when he's in Presumed Innocent. And I'm just like, when does he have time to, do law and coach his kid when he's, training constantly to be in this kind of physical condition?
Yeah, good point. Takes a lot of work to get that fit.
I guess if, he's so type A that he can't even let himself like go below, 10% body fat. or go above it.
It was all wrapped up quite quickly at the end of that show. So if you haven't seen it,
Yes.
I mean, you would never guess it.
But what a great cast in general, right? Ruth Negga is great as his wife, although they gave her this horrible, romance, this flirtation she has going on is so stupid. But anyway, they're just trying to give her something extra to do in her most agonized moments. She's really good. And Sarsgaard, what's his first
Oh
name?
yes, so good. Peter Sarsgaard.
Peter Skarsgård, yeah. Oh man, just incredible. What a great performance. He really stole the show, honestly.
He's so good, and he's so good in everything. You could never root for him because he always seems like he's the baddie in
Yes.
shows. Oh, but he just plays it so well.
Actually, Jake Gyllenhaal's brother-in-law. Did you know that?
Oh yes, I did. I think I found that out while watching this show.
Yeah, he's married to Maggie Gyllenhaal. Speaking of Maggie Gyllenhaal, do you know she has a Bride of Frankenstein movie coming out this year, 2025? She's directing.
Okay, I haven't seen her for a while.
Yeah, and she directed The Lost Daughter for Netflix. Really good, by the way, very good. And now she's got a big budget Bride of Frankenstein movie coming. So I'm looking forward to that one.
Very talented family.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. She's always great to watch as an actress. I wish she'd be acting a little bit more right now. Hopefully she'll be able to balance both things. So as Darren mentioned there, definitely something fun to watch with your spouse. My wife and I definitely had conversations about this show, even as it got sillier along the way. Another interesting misfire to some extent, but I still want to put it on the list here, is Disclaimer, another Apple TV Plus series. One that probably took itself way too seriously, to be honest. It could have been a little junkier and maybe been a little more fun. Definitely not a fun series across the board, but it does have quite a payoff, and that is Disclaimer, which we covered here in the podcast just recently, wrapped up in November. Very popular for us, by the way, here on the podcast. And Sohan and I had many mixed feelings about that show, but at its best, it is some of the best TV this year, for sure. Also on this list of honorable mentions, this most recent season of Slow Horses. This was, for me, the worst season of Slow Horses, but still very fun and pretty action-packed. This storyline was compacted down to, I think it all happens in a weekend, so very much a different kind of tempo than we saw in previous seasons of the show, but nonetheless, very satisfying. Speaking of shows where maybe I'm not really there to hang out with these folks, I am there for the plot, for the twists, for the new reinvention of the formula from year to year. I would say Slow Horses is one of those series that I actually do tune in for the characters and their dynamics. So if you like that type of show, this is a great one for it. And still a good show, the least of the available series of that show. But that doesn't mean it's bad. It's on my honorable mentions list for sure. And I have two more spy series to throw on that list. The Agency, which we are currently watching, which probably would have bumped something out of my top 10, but it has not finished yet. I know some people complain that this series might be a little slow. For me, this is why I like these spy shows. I like when it feels like a workplace drama, but then there is this intersection of the high stakes of politics and then all the questions of the demands of the job requiring that you be duplicitous. I like this, basically. I like this naturalistic view more than I like the shoot 'em up version of spy shows. And just to keep the spy thing going, less successful for me, we covered here on a podcast, The Day of the Jackal. The first half season of that, terrific, but it really did fall off significantly for me towards the end. Still an entertaining watch, for sure. You can hear our conversations about it here on the feed. And so much more spy stuff, but I still want to call out one more, a show that I liked very much, which was Black Doves, which is coming back for season 2, very popular on Netflix. The Keira Knightley spy series, which is definitely the silliest of these, to say the least. The tone is all over the place. And I prefer something like The Agency, by the way, that kind of tone over something like Black Doves. But I do appreciate when something kind of goes in a direction I don't want it to and is then somehow able to pull it in. And I think that that's really what Black Doves does so well, even as it becomes slapstick at some points and then downshifts once again to being very personal, intimate, and having very emotional stakes. I think the emotional stakes in Black Doves work really well, even as the mystery itself resolves in a pretty silly way, to be honest. But I'm in there because I love the relationship between the characters and their own internal struggles. And I very much look forward to a season 2 of this show, which we'll possibly get before the end of this very year. Something else to put onto the anticipation list. Okay, let's step away from the spy series, so many of them. Still in the honorable mentions here. Nobody Wants This, the romantic comedy on Netflix. I, in general, do not really go for rom-coms, but I do miss the fact that movies used to be sexy. Like even movies that weren't about sex, they could be sexy. And there's really very little interest in anything sexy in movies anymore. And maybe it's because we have these massive franchises that are really not for adult audiences, but it really is lacking. It's something that's lacking in movies recently, although it's making a comeback this year. We'll talk about the movie side of things later, but there is definitely a comeback to some extent of that this year. And Nobody Wants This is a rom-com where the two leads have great chemistry, and it's just so much fun to watch. It does peter out a bit, I have to say. Peters out a little bit as you approach the end of season 1, and this is coming back for season 2. There's a lot of setting up of the stakes for season 2, and that was less intriguing to me. But speaking of things that I could watch with my wife, the rare thing we watched together and we really enjoyed, and so much of that is because just fantastic work from the two leads here. And by the way, going back to Black Doves, a main reason that series works so well between Ben Whishaw and Keira Knightley and the cast in general, terrific chemistry between those leads as well as just the performances in general really sell those emotional stakes. And in Nobody Wants This, we were just smiling and laughing along to these characters and really rooting for them to have this romantic relationship, which is so rare nowadays. So Nobody Wants This, another good comedy, the rare good comedy in my opinion, also on Netflix. Okay, and last honorable mention, once again, just outside my top 10, probably the most one that I want to shout out here for sure, is Sweet Pea, also coming back for season 2. This is a adaptation of a novel by the same name, and Ella Purnell plays this girl, Rhiannon, who has never left her hometown. And she's been bullied, and she's had some family issues, and she continues to be pushed around in her current job at a newspaper. And one night, she accidentally kills one of these people who happens to be annoying her at that moment, not even her number one bully, by the way, and is empowered by this murder. And this show is funny, has an incredible soundtrack, by the way, a lot of bangers on the soundtrack, songs I have never heard before or songs I haven't heard in a very long time, and sets things up very intriguingly for a season 2. And what I like so much about this show is that we meet our protagonist as this total victim of her circumstance. And she certainly is. And the people that are bullying her are oftentimes not very nice people. But as the show evolves, we discover there's complexity to those quote unquote bullies as well. And also that our protagonist is not so innocent in the fact that she has allowed herself to, or has put herself in these circumstances over and over again. And the show doesn't shy away from this, but makes us question the fact of how complicit she is in her own undermining. So I really like this, and almost made my top 10, but not quite. Almost made my top 10. Oh, and of course, how could I have forgotten? I literally did not put this in my notes, but just remembered right now. The Bear, season 3 of The Bear, much disparaged. I honestly think that season 3 of The Bear has some of the absolute best episodes of that entire show, and yet I understand why there was a bit of a backlash against it. But because it isn't the best show of the year, again, like it was for season 1 and season 2, is not a reason that it was actually bad. And you definitely feel what's been stated before, that the show was supposed to be 3 seasons. They actually made it 4 because FX wanted extra episodes of this massively successful show, of course. And that basically they have taken season 4 and spread it out into an additional season and ended on somewhat of a cliffhanger. But I mean, every show, arguably, that is guaranteed a return is ending on a cliffhanger. None of these things really bothered me that much. I just think that there was maybe a couple of moments where it didn't quite do what it was hoping to do. But yeah, this could have easily been in my top 10. And I think it's still one of the best shows on TV. All right, we're in the top 10 finally. Number 10, Agatha All Along. In no small part, I put Agatha All Along in the top 10, not because a lot of those honorable mentions could have slotted in here, to be honest. But I did want to talk about a few things. First of all, I want to talk about Catherine Hahn and how absolutely great she is in every single thing she does. And she's just kills it in this role. Great in the WandaVision series and even more entertaining for sure in this whole series that's wrapped around her. And just what a run she's been on. Even her voice performance in the animated Spider-Man films. So entertaining in the Knives Out film, The Glass Onion sequel. And a show that came out last year, which I think she got a Emmy nomination for, and nobody saw. Tiny Beautiful Things. Terrific show. But once again, just incredible in this series. If her performance wasn't just so stellar, I don't think this show would be anywhere near my top 10. But also this entire cast of characters, Joe Locke and Aubrey Plaza, just to name two of these spectacular performances here, and the chemistry between the different witches. And if you have to see episode 1 just to see how she is trapped inside of this Mayor of Easttown, literally the Mayor of Easttown procedural, and how she's unaware that she's basically interacting with regular people. A hilarious episode 1, truly hilarious episode 1. And I believe episode 8, where we see the Patti LuPone character has a form of dementia, but we actually discover that it's a power she has where she can travel through time. And the layering of this dementia and this magical power is just incredibly well executed. Honestly, one of the best individual episodes of any TV show I saw all year. The rest of the series, there's definitely some spots in the middle that are a little dragged out or maybe even a little repetitive. And the last 2 episodes, very good. I mean, there's an emotional button on episode 10, the final episode of the season, which I thought was very good, but not up to par with the absolutely stellar Patti LuPone episode, which I mentioned. But you can't really can't knock a show down because it can't achieve greatness every single time it comes up to bat. But overall, I think this was a little overlooked critically, but not by audiences. This is the other reason I wanted to bring this up. This is the type of thing that Marvel and Star Wars and all these large franchises have to start to consider. That the fact that this show is so low stakes, it does not change the face of all the MCU from this point on. Those low stakes is what made this show successful. And guess what? The audiences agreed as well. This show premiered at around half of the viewership of some of those other MCU series. WandaVision and the first season of Loki are by far the most successful of those MCU series. But by the end of season 1 of Agatha All Along, the viewership numbers had nearly caught up to the finales of those more popular shows. And most important of all, when you think about the utter disaster from a financial standpoint and from a critical standpoint of things like Secret Invasion, which cost well over $200 million, the Agatha All Along series cost at most $35 million. That's the most expensive quote on what this thing cost, and turned out to be one of their biggest hits. So make a show with compelling characters that the stakes only matter in the context of the show. And guess what? They are getting a season 2 of this. So they didn't even intend to make this into a franchise. It may very well spin off a whole witch franchise within the MCU because people just like the characters and likes the story. So I wanted to call that out here. And guess what? My number 9, in line with this exact argument, it's Penguin. And same thing here. We do not need to have the entire DC universe expanded every single time you put something on the screen. Penguin was just a crime thriller around the character of Penguin and definitely intersects with the broader Gotham mythology. But primarily, it is just about these outsider characters, Penguin and Sophia Falcone, having the potential to inherit her father's mob family, but pushed to the side, overlooked, scapegoated by the family itself. And this interesting parallel ascent of the two characters, who are interestingly not only outsiders in the series, but of course in DC lore in general. These are not central characters to the DC mythologies. And they use that as an organizing concept around the series itself. And it paid off in spades. Another huge success where some of these DC core brands, I mean, the DC cinematic universe is obviously a fiasco at this point, but lower stakes, more personal stories. And guess what? People really like the show, and critics as well. Okay, my number 8 is a series that should win all of the production design Emmy Awards for the decade, practically. It is Ripley, the adaptation of The Talented Mr. Ripley. This was originally produced for Showtime and then was dumped and then acquired by Netflix. This series was not that popular, even on Netflix, although it was hugely popular for us. It is our most popular episode of our series, of our podcast ever. The people who did watch it loved it, apparently. And maybe that will be enough to continue the Ripley character. And I would very much like to see Andrew Scott playing an older Ripley, because my one complaint on this show is that he's too old to play the part. But of course, the Ripley series went on for many years, and the character aged decades in that period of time. So very much would like to see more of the Ripley novels adapted by this creative team. If it looks anywhere near as great as this one does, I would love to see it. And this was also, I think, number one on Darren's list. So let's hear what he had to say about it. By the way, we only did one episode on Ripley. I don't know if you ever listened to our episode on Ripley, but that is our biggest episode of the podcast ever. So that was not a hugely popular show, but for us, it was huge.
I loved that show. I could just sit and watch those visuals all day. So stunning.
That's how I felt about it. I thought it was a little sleepy for me. I actually took advantage of the Netflix 1.25 speed later on in the show. That's more on me than on the show itself. I just thought that, like you mentioned, the visuals in this show are incredible. Like, you could pause, and I did this sometimes, you could just pause the show at any point in time and frame it and put it on the wall. It's absolutely stunning visually, just absolutely stunning.
Killer. Yeah, I reckon that was my number one show of the year.
My one ding on that, I reread the Ripley book. If you haven't listened to that episode, by the way, you might want to, the podcast episode, because I do a comparison with the show versus the 1999 movie and the new series, and kind of just compare and contrast all of that, which I covered when I was watching it. Just the context of the book, it takes place about 10 years earlier than the 1960, which I think is the beginning year for Ripley. Andrew Scott is in his 40s. Ripley's supposed to be like in his 20s. And I honestly could not get past this. Like, he cannot pass for someone that young. And, the rest of the cast is also aged up, which is very different to imagine when you're reading Ripley, that this is a guy who's lost and, discovering himself to be a pure sociopath. But he is like Dexter. Let's talk about Dexter now. He's like Dexter at the beginning of his career, like just discovering his level of sociopathy. And it's a little weird to have somebody who's like in his midlife, and so that's my one quibble and also because I didn't know whether I was supposed to believe that he was an older person or if I was supposed to believe that he was this young guy and he just was aged inappropriately. So that confusion definitely impacted my viewing of the show. But man, that show, everybody should watch it because of just the absolutely incredible, design and style of that show.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Now, after I watched the series, I did watch the film again, which I hadn't seen in decades.
Many years, same thing with me. Yeah.
Oh, so good. Equally as amazing. It just, and if you want a younger Ripley, I mean, that's a young Matt Damon in the movie. And what an incredible story.
And I have to say that I prefer the 1999 version for the fact that Johnny Flynn, who I do like, I've seen him in a movie I highly recommend called Beast. It's so good. So do check that out. But I never see him as this playboy that you desperately want to be, which is the whole love-hate relationship he has with Dickie is his motivation of his first murder, basically. I just don't see it in the new version of the show. And once again, I'm just critiquing the new version of the show, which is excellent, but just calling out that things that I preferred in one version versus the other. But Jude Law in the first, in the 1999 version, is absolutely the person that, you can imagine Matt Damon like desperately wanting to idolize and maybe more than that.
Yeah, they're valid criticisms. They are very different.
It's a different take on the material. I'm not critiquing. I'm not saying that this one should have been that one. They're obviously two different things. I'm just saying that I don't buy the attraction necessarily in the contemporary version. Whereas, Jude Law shows up in the first version. He's just like, he's like Summers walked into the room,
Yeah, there's not many Jude Laws around, is there?
Especially at that point in time, right? We're watching Skeleton Crew and he's, still looks great for his age, but he's not what he was 25 years ago. So. As none of us are, by the way. So he's doing much better than I am. So I'm not going to critique him for that. Okay, my number 7 is such a low stakes show. It is Man on the Inside, the very popular, I think, series on Netflix. I'm pretty sure this is getting a season 2 as well. I originally covered this show on the podcast because I thought it would be in the midst of all of this heavy spy show coverage that on our podcast, that this would be a joking sitcom. This was created by Mike Schur, and I thought it might have some of the zany comedy of an older gentleman who is basically a spy inside of a nursing home trying to unravel some mystery. I thought it would be much more mystery heavy, to put it bluntly. What it turned out to be was really about aging more gracefully. And the reason this is ranked so highly for me is because personally, I am starting to think about these things as the people around me are aging, my parents and my wife's parents. These are all things that we are starting to think about, dealing with our friends and some of their aging parents, and seeing something that is not a nightmare scenario, but something that finds life and joy, even at this late point in life, was really just gentle and generous. And I really loved it, as did Sona, by the way. And we covered it here on a podcast. We have an episode about it if you want to check it out. But also very funny, really funny. Every episode, there were multiple times that I would laugh out loud. And Ted Danson is just a national treasure, and maybe never has appealed more so than he does in this role. And he's even mentioned the fact that he played the Sam Malone character, this kind of cocky, abrasive character, and has played that multiple times in his career. But that really isn't him. That is his performance. This character is much closer to the person he actually is. And he fits this role like a glove. It's really wonderful if you haven't seen it, and especially if you are dealing with any of these aging relatives. It is a really sweet and positive series. Not in my top 10, but I do want to shout it out here as well, is the show Shrinking, which just wrapped up its second season. An uneven season here, but I do want to shout it out because a lot of what I like about Man on the Inside, I think Man on the Inside's obviously the better show in my opinion, especially here Shrinking in its second season versus the first. It is having a little bit of growing pains, but still love these characters. And speaking of a show that will repeatedly deal with sometimes the most inconvenient, most difficult situations, whether it is breakups, whether it is tensions within a marriage, and will introduce these topics and then write its way out of it in very positive and honestly maybe a little too simplistic in the way that they resolve these sometimes insurmountable problems on that show. But in this day and age, I have to say that just seeing people constructively talking and joking with each other and using their histories together, not as a way to tear each other apart, but to come together and resolve their differences. I have to say that a generation ago, this type of show, honestly, would make me roll my eyes. And now I'm like, what a breath of fresh air. It's not just the same cynicism. And that's honestly what I gravitate to, the cynicism in like Breaking Bad or something. I definitely like those shows better, but at the point where there is no positivity in any aspect of our lives day to day, not in our political discourse, not in media coverage day to day, not even in our entertainment, I really need something like this. So Man on the Inside, the better version of it, but I do want to mention Shrinking as well. And if you haven't caught up on season 2, I just wrapped up recently and had a very touching finale. Okay, number 6. Speaking of British shows that had their worst season of series this year, like Slow Horses, we have Industry, this one on HBO. It's the worst season of this show, and yet it contains some of the absolute best episodes of this series ever. So you have to be on board for the ride of this show, which will be way over the top, and then will just nail a topic, just the current cultural moment we live in, this obsession with money that we have, and just nail it so perfectly. Sometimes in the same episode. So it is just all over the place. That is the energy of the show. For me, the previous seasons worked better. They were able to balance that out more so. Occasionally on this season of the show, it's just the only reason it's not ranked even more highly. Some of those things seem to be intentionally trying to grab the attention, maybe even intentionally trying to create a cultural moment so that the show would be more popular, because I've described the show as Succession meets Euphoria, and then maybe already mixing those things together, The Wolf of Wall Street, this druggy, hazy, money-obsessed amoral concoction of themes, and it is so of the moment. So many of the types of financial fiascos that happen on the show, and how things that on paper should fail outright and everybody assumes they're going to fail get bailed out by governments or by these larger powers that just decide who wins and who loses. But what makes the show so compelling is these characters. Once again, every time you come back into these characters, so fascinated by the psychology of each one of them, of the chips they have on their shoulders because of not only their backgrounds of how much wealth they have, but also how did they acquire that wealth? The whole issue of class that is so relevant in UK culture, which we don't even think about here in the US as much, but is so relevant here in this context. So just exposing me to this financial world, to the cultural differences, even geographically in the UK as well, and all of this steeped in this druggy, sometimes psychedelic, but so vibey, this incredible soundtrack, beautiful music, so much musical discovery I make when I listen to this show. And yeah, just the vibes are incredible. It's definitely one of the vibiest shows on TV. Only Euphoria is more vibey than this show. There's definitely some cross-pollination there. But these characters are just fascinating, their psychologies, and all of them just being corrupted or pushing against the corruption that this world they have chosen to enter is slowly just stealing away their humanity. And then how much of that humanity are they willing to lose? And in this season, specifically, you see characters starting to perhaps push back on some of this erosion of their souls. And this could have really been an excellent season finale. The last episode of this show is really extraordinary and could have been a terrific finale to this series, which is coming back for another year. And HBO loves these creators, by the way. They have signed an exclusive production deal with them, so we may see even more shows from them. I can't wait to see what else they come up with, and I can't wait to see the next season of Industry. Even though all those caveats that I put it down at number 6, and I had so many issues, more so than with previous seasons, this is still really something that people should be watching way more than they are. This is not a very popular show. It is starting to cross over a little bit. Maybe next year is the year that this thing breaks out. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to be covering this one next year on the podcast. All right, let's take a short break before we get into the top 5. Kicking things off in the top 5 is Say Nothing. This is the Hulu series about the Troubles in Ireland, based on the bestseller. And this is just a great coming-of-age series, as well as a historical document about this moment in time. And it does so many things so well. It's about these two sisters and how not only are they growing up in a home where their parents have already fought this fight for decades. They are pacifists, as is the flavor within their generation at that moment in time in the mid to late 60s. And as a rebellion against their parents and their form of protest and rebellion, they begin on this more hippie-ish version of revolt. And we see how that metastasizes over time. But at the beginning, it is so thrilling to see them dressing up as nuns. If you've seen the trailer for this show, pulling off these robberies, the very way that this very Catholic and traditional old school society has limited prospects for these young women and how they want to have more agency in their lives. And that draws them into this thrilling moment. Then the culture itself starts to change. You go from the more antiseptic pop of the time to punk rock in the 70s, and how these women go through this evolving moment in history, and how the very rebels who and endanger their lives and motivate them to perform some of these terrible acts then eventually become mainstream characters, become politicians, and how these people feel left behind over and over and over again. And I think it's a really relevant story, not only given that cultural moment then, but of course, the cultural moment we have now when we think about multiple places around the globe where there is fighting still occurring now between multiple peoples still trying to define or protect their homelands. And really highly recommended. Say Nothing, available to binge on Hulu. I think it just premiered in December, so a recent one. Another show that I think is not that popular. People really should watch. It's really excellent. If you have 7 or 8 hours to dedicate to it, it's definitely worth it. And entertaining, by the way. I don't want to make it sound like this is just a slog. It's going to put you through the ringer emotionally for sure. And it's a roller coaster ride. How you root for these girls and then maybe become wary of some of the more extreme actions they take. But all of that makes it a really compelling watch. Okay, number 4, the most hilarious sitcom I've seen on TV in many years. I rarely will watch a show by myself and laugh out loud. But the show is The English Teacher, English Teacher. Everybody I've recommended this to loves it. And that's my sales pitch for it. There's nothing deep or, in some ways it might be revolutionary in its own way. But the reason to watch this is because you will laugh. I do not know anybody, even people I've recommended this to who are multiple generations older than I am, said, oh, we watched that show. And I was like, I don't know if they're going to like this. This show is about a gay English teacher from high school students in Austin, Texas. And this amalgamation of Austin, which is a very progressive culture, especially among the younger generation, but still in this very conservative state of Texas, and allowing the show to be an equal opportunity offender to everybody. It just makes fun of every single character for different reasons. Everybody's in the right sometimes, everybody's in the wrong oftentimes. This show just makes no bones about it, and it is just so funny. And like I said, maybe a little radical in its ability to be open-hearted and yet very politically incorrect. And that is definitely something that we have not seen in comedy for quite some time now, I would say. But this is really funny. And everyone I've recommended it to, younger folks, my nephews, older folks, like my wife's parents, for example, have all come back and said, oh, that show was so funny. We binged it right away. So it's just funny. Watch it. As long as you're not offended by this, because this is a sexually frank show. It literally feels like you could even just drop commercial breaks in here, like it is a 20-something minute sitcom you'd watch on ABC, but it is so foul-mouthed and so sexually frank that obviously it could not be on network television, but it really feels like an R-rated network TV sitcom. And it's only 8 episodes long, which really left me wanting more. It feels like there's so many even basic things that have not been connected, just certain characters that we haven't seen the interactions we're hoping to see yet, which is great, by the way. I want to be left wanting more. I don't want to have 100 episodes of a show. So maybe someday this show will be so mainstream that I'll be completely sick of it. But at this moment, it's just the first chapter of this very funny group of misfits and goofballs working in this school together and touching on every possible social taboo in very entertaining ways. Okay, number 3 is the word of mouth phenomena of the year, Baby Reindeer, this incredible show that debuted on Netflix and out of nowhere just became an utter ratings phenomena, and then was in the tabloids, and then there were court hearings about it. But this story about this terrible stalking that occurs between this young man and a woman who runs into him in a bar one night, and their twisted symbiotic relationship, and how it forces the protagonist to acknowledge a horrible assault from his past. This was also on Darren's list, so let's cut to that conversation briefly. All right, you also have Baby Reindeer on here, which, again, I completely agree, one of my absolute favorites of the year. And the total surprise, I saw this, had no interest in watching it. It's so funny, the phenomena of this show that came out of nowhere and became this massive word of mouth success. But I did exactly what other people did in this instance, where I opened up the app, new on Netflix, and I saw it and ignored it. And then maybe the second or third day it was available, it was already number 3 or number 4 on the charts. And they kept trying to push it to me. And I was like, these episodes are short. Let me see what this is. Some corny comedy about a stalker. All right, let me watch this. And I binged the entire thing. I was like, well, not the entire thing. I actually stopped after the sexual assault because I was so disturbed by it. And then I came back to it a little bit later and also covered it on the podcast. Another popular episode for us, by the way. But yeah, I was so knocked out by that show. And part of it was just I did not see any of that coming at all. What was your experience of watching it?
Yeah, similar. I just saw everything online. You've got to watch Baby Reindeer, and I was like, okay, great. Oh, it's a stand-up comedian, and
Yeah,
he's
right.
he's got his show. Great, it'll be a comedy.
Right,
And
right.
I kept waiting for the jokes.
When is the comedy coming?
But so watchable, so stunning, and just the way that he frames it as a true story. I had to keep watching and just, oh, agonizing stuff. And then I worked with a guy, and he couldn't watch the show because he's had to change his number a couple of times. He's
Oh
had a
boy.
stalker, similar, not to this extent, but he just was like, I'm sure it's great. I'll never watch it. And I was like, that's probably a good
Understandable.
idea
Yes, I think if you've
because
been
my
stalked, yes,
God.
what a nightmare, like a true nightmare scenario. What's fascinating about that show is how brave and egoless in some ways his depiction of himself is, because he openly admits that he has done this to himself, right? There's this
Mm.
incredible moment. I watched the show once, and then months and months later, my wife watched it finally, and she did it on her own. I didn't even encourage her to watch it, but she did the same thing where she got totally sucked into it. So I ended up walking into the room when she was watching it and intentionally tuning in on certain things. Did not rewatch the sexual assault part, which disturbed me. I'm like, I don't want to watch that part again. But most of the rest of it I watched and did appreciate some of the comedy that he was going for, even in this really bleak material. But I did love, just to point that out, the very end button on the very first episode of the show where she tries to friend him on Facebook and he's just like, accept. And I'm just like, what are you doing? Happy Together is playing on the soundtrack. It's like, man,
It was just an agonizing watch. And the fact that he was a terrible stand-up comedian at the start, just
true. Yeah.
watching his act, oh my God. But this guy, it was such an amazing work of art. How is he going to do anything
Yeah.
next? I don't know how he can reinvent himself or how he can be a bit part in movies or God knows what he can do. But it was him and also the actor that played his stalker. They were just iconic. It was just it's a must-watch show if you can
Yeah.
handle it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, apparently many people could. This is like a hugely popular show on Netflix. One of their, whatever, it's their top 10 shows of all times, which is a show they paid like almost nothing for comparatively. You know, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on like the three body problem.
Hmm.
And now this thing cost them whatever, a few million bucks probably. And, a phenomenally successful show. And he has written before. He wrote for that Netflix show, Sex Education, which is also very popular.
Oh, okay.
And
Yep.
so he's done work in the past for Netflix. But yet, to your point of being on screen, I would say that he has an absolutely horrible haircut in this series. So maybe if he just fixes his hair, he could get away with playing a different kind of role.
Okay. It's as easy as that.
Maybe he gave himself a terrible haircut. This way, I won't get typecast in the future. When I walk in, they'll be like, "Oh, he doesn't look anything like he looked in that show." That was Baby Reindeer once again on Netflix. And if you're one of the few people who haven't seen it yet, it's tough stuff, but definitely worth a watch. And a very quick binge. Okay, number 2. One of the most massive and impressive productions of the past few years, Shogun, which won all the Emmy Awards last year, and deservedly so. Shogun, of course, is another adaptation of the James Clavell novel from the 70s, and previously adapted all the way back in 1980, a huge success at that time, rating success, and a huge rating success now. And so fascinating that taking the Japanese perspective of the series and heightening it in a way where most of the show was even in Japanese and did not impact its ratings at all, massively successful and just incredibly beautifully produced, and actually returning for a second season, which, of course, there's no book to adapt it from, but there is history because that first season of the show and the book itself is based on a true historical character and a true historical moment in time. So definitely more story to be told. I have a lot of confidence that these creators will make something good, but of course, you don't have a book to work off of. That can have its drawbacks. So I'm not guaranteeing that season 2 is going to be as good as season 1, but just a massive and beautiful production with incredible performances, really captivating romance, massive battle sequences, and surprisingly no battle sequences when you're expecting them. It's just one of the most sumptuous series you would watch. If not for Ripley, this would be the number one most visually impressive series of the year. Okay, that leaves my number one. I am intentionally not putting Shogun at my number one because I want to shout out another series I loved, and I don't think it gets enough attention here, although it is getting a second season. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, available to stream on Hulu. And this show was created by Donald Glover and Francesca Sloan and stars Donald Glover and Maya Erskine. And speaking of the year of spy shows, part of the reason I wanted to put it at number one, by the way, is such a year of spy shows now and how this once again lends itself as a metaphor for the world we live in, the performative aspects of having a career. Maybe you move somewhere, or maybe you compromise yourself in some way, or the expectations you had in your life for the career path you choose. Or in the case of these characters, maybe, and I've had this experience in my life, or felt this way at least, maybe you're a pretty talented, pretty smart person, but there's really nothing in the generic day-to-day jobs that you apply for that really work for your certain personality skills. Well, what if you were really cut out to be a spy? And then, of course, another layer to this, you are paired up with somebody else who may be a really good match for you, even as a spouse. That's what they are indicating. So it becomes this metaphor for the compromises you make to have certain luxuries in your life. And when you're dating, or the metaphor for dating as discovering each other as you go forward in this relationship that you're kind of trapped in, seeing people who have been around in this same position as you are over a period of time, judging your own marriage against that marriage, and seeing that even that is yet another layer of performance. So it feels very much of the time as Glover seems to really gravitate to these topics that really put their finger on the pulse of the culture at that moment. He also produced a really interesting show last year about toxic fandom called Swarm. And even if you don't watch that entire show, which I find really interesting, but it is a difficult watch to say the least, the episode where Billie Eilish plays a cult leader is truly one of the best episodes. And you can pretty much watch it as a bottle episode, and a really excellent hour of TV there too. But Glover's, I'm always interested in seeing what he does next. Atlanta, of course, was an uneven but overall fascinating series, to say the least. And now this will also be extended, by the way. Season 2 is coming with at least some of the cast new. But some of the themes we're talking about over and over again, and of course, we're about to talk about Severance on this podcast, this question as to what you do for a living, how that defines you as a person. And even if you're like, well, I'm just doing that for a job, there are outcomes to those activities. In this case, obviously terrible outcomes sometimes that you're trying to distance yourself from. And then once again, if you have somebody there in your house that you're paired up with, does it just give you yet another excuse to be the worst version of yourself? Just some of the questions that this show asks. And of course, it is sexy and it is funny and it is thrilling. There are definitely over-the-top action sequences in this that you don't necessarily see in some of these other spy shows. So it is definitely embracing the jet-setting, action-packed elements of the spy genre and still tying in those thematics about identity and moral compromise, and also throwing in rom-com in there too. So quite an interesting combination. Worked for me across the board. And once again, a podcast episode we have here in the feed. Sona and I both really like that show. And that's my number one. Is it really my number one? It's the one I wanted to put at number one. But it is excellent, regardless of how many caveats I put around that one, number one. All right, a few more things I can throw up here. Incompletes. I could have almost put The Bear as an incomplete, but honestly, that seemed like short shrift because I actually do think it was a satisfying season of show. Incomplete number one is Squid Game 2. I honestly cannot tell you how I feel about this until I see season 3. I do not think this was a fully developed season of television. It ends on a cliffhanger, but not only does it end on a cliffhanger, in every possible way, it is in the middle of its story. Luckily, season 3 was shot at the same time, so it's really more like what Netflix has done in the past, and other producers as well, where you get part A of the season, and then part B of the season. And I am actually seeing it that way, that this is part 2A rather than a full season of TV, because it is not. And I will reserve judgment until season 3, or the remainder of the episodes, I should say, which are the final batch of episodes, which I think is smart, because season 1 of Squid Game really does not need a second season. Season 1 is a brilliant season of television and works really well in the context of how this new hyper-capitalism has made us all judge ourselves in the context of what we have and what we're willing to do to have those things. And of course, you think about the Mr. Beast games and things like that, where people are willing to humiliate themselves, put everything on the line for the money, and maybe even more so for the fame. No fame issue here in this particular case. These are secret games. I think people watch that and wonder, how far would I go for that amount of money? Which, of course, is the magic of that massively successful first season of the show. This one, of course, is still doing gangbusters business, but I honestly can't say if this is going to be a 5 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10 until I see the remainder of the episodes. So incomplete for now. Another incomplete, House of the Dragon, season 2. Season 1 of House of the Dragon, I actually liked quite a bit. I would have preferred that maybe we had only seen the younger actors finish off some particular story arc before we jumped to another season with the older actors. That was quite uneven in that season 1. But overall, I was very satisfied with the first season of that show, especially the first half of that season of the show. With season 2, I feel like it took a long time for this show to get going. It has one of the absolute best episodes of not only of House of the Dragon / Game of Thrones, it is in conversation with one of the top 10 episodes of any of those shows. It comes a little more than halfway through that season of show, even as that is really the moment when the plot really kicks into gear, where chickens are coming home to roost for one of the most unlikable characters on that show, who has put all the pieces in place to unleash this weapon of mass destruction, and in so doing destroys his worldview of what being a soldier is. It is an incredible episode of television, and it seems to be kicking in the remainder of the season. And then it basically just says, what's going to happen next? TBD. And I know this had to do something with the writer's strikes, and I know people hated this season of the show because of the way it left things. For me, it took a long time to get going. And then just when I was really intrigued by the story, it ends. And as I mentioned, this has to do with the writer's strike. They were ready to put the show on the air. They had a window for HBO's production, so they just wrapped things up where they were. And there is easily 2 or 3 more episodes of show to wrap this story up. Definitely an incomplete for me. And honestly, whatever they do starting season 3 and throughout would probably define as to whether I continue to watch this show. Although I think it's only scheduled for 4. I think that's decided that 4 seasons is the totality of that show. Hopefully, knowing where things are going to wrap up will give us a satisfying final 2 seasons of that show. It remains to be seen. All right, and my last award is for I Did Not Get This, the one show that is on a lot of top 10 lists and got very good reviews back in the day. And it's hard to talk about this because there was such an ugly, negative audience reaction to this show. I am not dinging it for those things. I just didn't find it compelling. It is True Detective Night Country, a show that I was so looking forward to. I am a fan in general of True Detective, love season 1 of True Detective, like season 3 very much, hated season 2. I did not hate this 4th season of the show, but its origins are in being a movie about this night country, this murder mystery set in this particular fascinating milieu, by the way, this permanent midnight, basically. And I'm a fan of horror in general. I'm already a fan of True Detective. I'm a huge fan of Jodie Foster. And maybe it was my anticipation. And by the way, nearly unanimous praise when this critics got an early look at the show. So all that is to say that I maybe had my expectations too high, but I thought this show meandered. I thought some of the character beats are ridiculous. I, in general, really liked the performances, but the whole trying to shoehorn in elements of this broader mythology, which they definitely overtly inject here in a way that has not existed in the previous True Detectives. And I think that's why HBO was so excited about this. The potential of tying together a mythology that ties together all these seasons of shows, like a broad conspiracy. Taking that conspiracy and explicitly making it supernatural didn't quite work for me. And the payoff to the mystery, I did not find it that interesting, especially considering it's kind of hand-wavy, and it also is illogical that some of these discoveries could have been made much earlier. So I was disappointed with the mystery. I was disappointed with the supernatural elements. I found some of the performances uneven, and I felt like other than its setting being fantastic, I didn't get it. I just don't get the love for this show. It's not awful by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not really good. I would not recommend people watch it, but I just had someone this week catch up with it and tell me how much they loved it. So maybe I'm in the minority here. Maybe I'm the one who's wrong. I am curious to see another season of this, especially if they can develop some of these things that I felt were introduced and kind of dropped immediately on this show towards the end. So maybe there is a broader strategy for these tying these shows together, and maybe it'll pay off eventually. For me, at this moment, this didn't work for me pretty much at all. All right, here's just some of the shows we can anticipate. Already, by the way, I've seen the first 2 episodes of this with my wife, who works in the medical field, and she was also very impressed with this show, The Pit, which is already available on HBO Max. So I did want to shout that out because I don't know when we're going to get back to it. It has a 15-episode run, so at some point we'll probably discuss it here on the podcast. But currently already available, the first 2 episodes. Of course, Severance, we've already discussed it, and we will be discussing it starting this week. Prime Target, as I mentioned before, we'll be covering those in conjunction. Okay, some new things we haven't discussed. Paradise on Hulu. I did not watch This Is Us, but this comes from the creator of that show, Dan Fogelman, and stars Sterling K. Brown, one of the stars of that series. And I just saw the trailer for this during one of the football games this weekend, and it really did intrigue me. There's a community where VIPs go to retire, a fictional one here, of course, called Paradise. And apparently the president, played by James Marsden, has access to all of the secrets, all the government secrets that have been kept under wraps for decades at least, turns up dead. And then who is behind this assassination? And I really did like the trailer for this. So that suddenly is on my radar. And that starts on the 28th of January. In February, the same week, The White Lotus, definitely a show we will be covering here on the podcast. The same week premieres Yellow Jackets, season 3 of that show. I was a little disappointed by the movement of the plot in season 2. I am still intrigued. We will probably not be going week to week, but we will be covering it in some way here on the podcast. We have some new cast members joining the show. The White Lotus is coming back as well, as I mentioned. The show has moved to Thailand. Natasha Rothwell is returning from the previous season, or season 1 of the show, I should say. But in general, a new storyline. And I don't really know much more about this. I don't need to. I have a lot of confidence in this show. I loved season 1, loved season 2, especially season 2. Robert De Niro stars in yet another spy show, Zero Day for Netflix, premiering February 20th, in which there's a cyber attack that knocks out the electricity in the United States, and then the need to discover what's going on, of course. And as if we weren't already excited for another espionage show with Robert De Niro on Netflix, an interesting combination already. Joan Allen, Angela Bassett, and Jesse Plemons all on board as well. One of my most anticipated, this is from March 14th. I'm not sure how broadly popular this is going to be, but a series called Dope Thief, based on a novel from 2009, from the writer of Top Gun Maverick. And this takes place in Philadelphia. Brian Tyree Henry and Wagner Moura play friends who pretend to be DEA agents to rob a house where they suspect there's something there. Much to their surprise, they end up infiltrating and robbing the center of a massive narcotics operation, and then are running for their lives from the criminals and the cops as well. So definitely looking forward to that one. And that's on Apple TV Plus. There's a lot of Apple TV Plus content this year. They are trying to aggressively grow their TV brand. And some of these projects, all of these projects, honestly, look good to me, but they have a not great batting average. So we will see how many of these actually connect. I am intrigued by almost all of them, so I'm going to shout them out here. The Studio is the next one, March 26th. And this is stars Seth Rogen trying to rescue their failing movie studio. I believe Catherine Hahn is a regular here as well. Always great to see her, of course. And apparently this show will also be filled with celebrity cameos. So the franchise, for example, something that Darren recommended to me here on the podcast, something that I thought was uneven, but very funny. And I do like these Inside Hollywood type comedies. The franchise was canceled after one season, but let's see how the studio is. Okay, and then another show we are absolutely going to cover here on the podcast, maybe Sona's most anticipated show of the year, Your Friends and Neighbors, also Apple TV Plus, premiering on April 11th, has already been renewed for a second season. Early buzz on this show is really strong. And this is Jon Hamm not doing an anthology show like he did on Fargo or getting a guest role like he did on The Morning Show, but his first starring central role in a series since Mad Men. And I love the premise of this show. And it ties into so many themes that we've already touched on the show here. He's a hedge fund manager that lives in a very opulent neighborhood, but it turns out he's actually approaching bankruptcy. And he starts to rob from his friends and neighbors. This is the name of the show, by the way, Your Friends and Neighbors. And as he infiltrates the neighbors' homes and starts stealing their valuables, he also starts to discover some of their secrets. So I love this idea. I love thematically how it fits into the culture at this moment. And in general, always like to see Jon Hamm as a somewhat villainous character, at least complex. There's a very few bright spots in the Star Wars universe, but Andor Season 1 was absolutely extraordinary. And Season 2 is coming back. By the way, if you haven't heard this show cost $700 million to produce Season 1 and Season 2. So these shows cost an absolute fortune. We are not going to see this kind of spending again on these streamers. Andor is one of the least successful of those Star Wars series. And ironically, one of the most expensive, one of the least successful, and yet truly exceptional TV watching. And by the way, you do not need to be a Star Wars fanboy to like Andor Season 1. It is just, talking of spy shows again, it is just an espionage show. It is great. Season 1 is great. I assume Season 2 will be equally great. Undated, but announced for spring, sometime in the spring, March, April, The Last of Us Season 2. This is another one of those examples of shows that didn't fully work for me, but I'm still anticipating another season, and that is The Last of Us. I have significant issues with the way the show honestly sloppily deals with the things that should be the bread and butter of a action/zombie show. But the character stuff is really powerful and still very intrigued by Season 2. And of course, the production of Season 1, beautifully produced, although, like I said, I have issues with some of the plot points and especially the way they not really think out the action beats of the show, which really should be better. And probably right as The Last of Us wraps up, there will also be the prequel, A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, in the universe of Game of Thrones. I am curious about something like this. This is what I mentioned, why I liked the Penguin and the Agatha series, like the House of the Dragon. Let's not make another show that is about here's how this king rose to power, and we're winking at the mythology in the more popular IP entry, the Game of Thrones, obviously. Let's not do that. Let's just set a story in this world and then develop these characters. And if we're interested, then we can tie all these characters together and the mythology can expand. But let's just tell an isolated, interesting story. And apparently that is what we're getting here. So I do have some hopes that this Night of the Seven Kingdoms will work better for me than House of the Dragon, especially by the time we got to Season 2. Some huge series wrapping up this year. The Bear, its final season this summer, like clockwork, 4 years in a row. I'm really going to miss not having this show drop every summer, but we are getting that fourth season, which was shot around the same time as the third, so we'll definitely make its deadline or premiere date. We're probably looking at June. On Netflix, also, the final season of Stranger Things. It has been such a long break between these seasons, and the kids were already kind of aged out of their roles. I cannot imagine with these kids in there. I've seen some of them actually, but can only imagine seeing this in the binge where all the kids are a foot taller than they were, and they're supposedly 2 years older, maybe. But will they somehow tie that into the broader mythology of the show? maybe. I thought that the last season, as far back as it was pretty interesting. They've maybe tried to tie things up too much, but I am curious to see how they try to resolve this, and we'll see. I am curious. I'm very curious. I don't know if it's going to be any good, but I'm very curious to see what they come up with. And that'll be the final season, by the way, of that show, understandably. Speaking of Netflix, another season of Wednesday, their second most successful series ever on Netflix, behind only Squid Game. I did not see the first season of Wednesday, but I got to shout it out. It's one of the most popular shows of all times. And also on Netflix, something I always look forward to. I really like anthologies, even when they're uneven. Even if I just get 1 or 2 good episodes out of an anthology, I'm always intrigued. And we're getting Black Mirror Season 7, something we'll definitely be discussing here on the podcast sometime this summer. Netflix really doesn't announce dates until they're within weeks of it, but we can expect that sometime this summer. I believe we'll also be getting another season of Love, Death, and Robots this summer as well from Netflix. That is something I always look forward to. Another anthology sci-fi series. And just one more show that has definitely been announced to come out before or during the summer. A show I very much enjoyed that we've been waiting a very long time for the sequel, which is Poker Face. Poker Face Season 2. This, of course, is the show with Natasha Lyonne, where she can always tell. She has a nearly supernatural, or maybe supernatural, ability of telling whenever anybody's lying, and how she becomes basically a Columbo character, who when someone lies to her, she can never let it lie. Why are they lying to me? And that usually gets her into the middle of a murder investigation. Really entertaining season 1 of that show if you've never seen it. And season 2 is coming this year. And some other guaranteed, or they've been announced, some other shows that have been announced for the year that we have no dates for at all. Noah Hawley's Alien Earth. I actually am very concerned about what this show is even about, but very curious. Always interested in seeing what Noah Hawley comes up with, and a fan in general of the Alien franchise. Speaking of old sci-fi franchises, the new Blade Runner series, also very curious to see that coming to Amazon Prime. No official date announcement yet. And another curious franchise extension, It, Welcome to Derry, which is supposed to have premiered in January on HBO, and now has been just starting to get into the news again, which sounds like this is what usually happens before HBO makes an announcement for the show. But it seems with the White Lotus and The Last of Us Season 2, and then the Game of Thrones spinoff in the summer, will we have to wait all the way close to Halloween again? It's possible. It might have been pushed all the way to October. Originally, they were announcing it for the end of last year, 2024. So we'll see. It's finished, and there has been some buzz about it recently. So hopefully we won't have to wait that much longer for that. Another anthology, in a way, has continuity, but is basically an anthology of other Stephen King stories tied together into this story centrally around the town of Derry. So could be bad, but still curious. And 2 more Apple TV Plus science fiction series I have to shout out. One is Murderbot, which is based on a best-selling series of novels and stars Alexander Skarsgård as Murderbot, an android that is programmed to be a killing machine, but actually just wants to hang out at home and watch television. I like this absurdist premise of this show, and of course has a successful series of books around it. So apparently the story evolves over time. Apple does a lot of book adaptations. They probably want this thing to succeed and for them to continue the series going forward. I'm wary again of any kind of sci-fi book adaptations from Apple, but I'm hoping for the best here. And one last Apple TV Plus series that is definitely one of my most anticipated, would probably be near the very top of my list if I had an actual date for it, although it has been promised sometime this year. It is a show that currently is shooting as Waikaro 339, but apparently is a very grounded drama with elements of horror and science fiction, which already sounds like something I would be interested in. But it comes from Vince Gilligan and stars Rhea Seehorn, a reunion of some of the talent from Better Call Saul, including some of the writers of that show. And Seehorn has described it very much in line with The Twilight Zone. So a series that has a continuous storyline, but maybe has these anthology elements that deals with elements of horror and science fiction. In some ways, it sounds like Black Mirror, but with some storyline tying together the broader mythology. All of that sounds great to me. It could also be terrible, but on paper, I am 100% on board with all of that, including the talent, including the premise. So that is some of the shows we're looking forward to this year. All right, so that is my rundown of the season. I think I'm approaching that magic 1 hour mark where I get tired of hearing myself talk, so probably the correct amount of time. If you'd like to support the podcast, a few ways you could do that. One, give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts if you have never done so, or on your podcatcher of choice. Spotify, for example, also allows you to rate the podcasts. Send us an email. We always look forward to hearing any kind of communication with our listeners. needssomeintroduction@gmail.com. Check out our backlog for coverage of any of these shows. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Shogun, Baby Reindeer, Say Nothing, Man on the Inside, Ripley, Agatha All Along, Presumed Innocent, Fallout, The Bear and House of the Dragon, and Squid Game as well. All shows we've discussed here on the podcast in the past. Say Nothing, did I mention that? We've covered that here as well. And we have a YouTube channel. Do subscribe to us on YouTube, even if you don't primarily listen to our podcast there. If we pick up subscribers there, we will get pushed through their algorithm. And honestly, I never talk about this because no one really listens to us on YouTube, although we've had a couple of episodes go semi-viral on there. We've had hundreds of downloads on some of our episodes out of the blue. So do subscribe there. Maybe that'll help other people discover the podcast. And if the traffic on YouTube picks up, maybe I'll start doing some YouTube-only content. So yet another reason to subscribe there if you're curious to check it out. There's just the podcast there now, but maybe additional video content if we pick up more subscribers. And of course, if you are going to be listening to Severance or The Agency, check out our previous episodes in the current feed as well. All right, that's it for now. I'll talk to you soon.